In this lecture, we're going to be talking about architecture and society. So part of that discussion is really defining what is architecture, or what do we think architecture is. Now, part of this lecture is going to be based on opinions, some subjectivity, your experience. So I kind of want you to think, as we're going through talking about this, what you think architecture is, or what your experience with architecture has been in the past. Part of the quiz for today, at the end of the lecture, is going to be for you to describe your experience with architecture, if any. I mean, you've had experience with architecture, but if you've thought about it, or how much you've thought about it, and maybe the impact it's had on you, or, if it hasn't had any at all or very little. But even whether we're conscious of it or not, architecture plays a role in all of our lives. If we had never been into a building, or we never had any kind of interaction with any type of built environment, that might be different. But even in the most primitive conditions or cultures, or ancient cultures, there's always been some form of shelter or built environment that played a role in people's lives and culture. So let's take a look at kind of the definition of what we think architecture is. So for this class, we're going to broadly define architecture. We could say, well, architecture is buildings, or it's this particular thing, or that specific thing. But broadly defined, as we talk about architecture as it relates to society, we could say architecture is the physical manifestation of who we are as a culture and also as individuals. And that's a pretty big statement, because it's saying anything, any aspect of our lives somehow becomes manifest by the environment that we create for ourselves. Now, sometimes we operate in an environment that is not defined by us, or it's defined by someone else. But given the opportunity to customize our own environment, if we each did that, and we do to some extent, depending on where we live, or how much or how little we can change our physical environment, but that typically says something about the individual, if you've made those choices or customized your space on an individual basis. Or it also says something as a culture based on the kinds of selections that we make for our built environment. And that can vary depending on our geography, our climate, our philosophy about life, and how we see the world. But we're going to look at some specific things in this lecture that kind of contribute to that physical manifestation. Now, the architecture philosophy and values really does vary between individuals and culture, because culture is a collective identity, and individuals can potentially define for themselves what it is that they think is important, and they can emphasize that in their built environment and their space. So let's look at a couple of examples of that. Now, the first thing we want to look at are values. Now, values from a sociological standpoint provide some kind of internal reference point for people to determine to them what is useful, what is appealing or beautiful, what is good or beneficial or desirable. Now, those things, if you have certain values based on those things, then you're going to make choices or decisions based on that. Now, that could be, lifestyle or cultural choices, but the architecture that we inhabit usually grows out of those values. So if we look at a certain space, so let's look at this image, and this is an image of a building, we can make some determinations about the values of the people who created it. It might have to do with nature and a connection to the outside world. It might even be, some other value about personal gathering spaces or personal seclusion even. This does not appear to be like a community space. This appears to be a private space. So we can make some assumptions. Now, when we're talking about architectural observations, we'll talk a bit about this in the next couple of lectures in the coming weeks. We're looking at just observing the values that we see in different types of architecture. Now, sometimes initially we have this rush to judgment, like, I don't like that, or I wouldn't choose this for myself. That's fine, but we're looking at this from kind of a sociological standpoint and saying, okay, instead of trying to tell the architecture what it should be, we're just looking at it at face value and trying to determine the values of the people who inhabit it, or the culture that it exists in, or kind of why it got there. So we're kind of observing and not judging at this point. Now, it's not that judgment is bad, it's just in the kind of process that we're going to go through. Let's try and look at this from an observational standpoint before we get into some more critical issues of judgment and things like that. So we're talking about values, and there are values of the individual, personal values, and then some collective cultural values that we see. Now, sometimes when we talk about values, that could be someone's beliefs. It could be their ethical or moral values. It can be religious. Sometimes in architecture we talk about aesthetic values. So, what you deem to be beautiful or not attractive, or appealing or unappealing or uncomfortable, either physically uncomfortable or psychologically uncomfortable, or things that are the opposite, where it gives you a sense of well-being and psychological comfort. So let's look at some very kind of disparate examples, but you'll see that individual values and cultural values are pretty different because of their collective and singular nature for the individual. So the first one that we're going to look at is an example of individual values. So this is a professor at Houston-Tillotson University here in Austin, and this is Dr. Jeff Wilson, and he's also known as Professor Dumpster. So if you've seen any of his work, he has lived in a dumpster for a year and chosen to do so for a variety of reasons. Now, he has since moved out of the dumpster, but he has spent his year in the dumpster, and he moved out a few months ago. But this is just a regular, standard, Texas disposal dumpster. He's kind of retrofitted it in some ways on the inside, but this has not been modified too much. I mean, it's a pretty standard dumpster. And we talk about the individual values here. I think many people have the reaction that they're not observing, they're judging and saying, well, I could not live in a dumpster, right? They're kind of rushing to that. But if we look at it from an observational standpoint, we can say, okay, the choice of living in dumpster is informing us about what he values and what his kind of principles and guiding principles or beliefs are. So let's take a look at some of those. So Professor Dumpster he had moved into this dumpster as part of kind of an educational experiment. So he's an environmental scientist, and in thinking about just consumption and large-scale issues of sustainability and architecture and just kind of even from a sociological standpoint, like what it would be like to live in a dumpster. It's been an experiment for him, and so he's essentially done research with himself in this experiment. So this is his house that he used to live in, and then when he moved into the dumpster, he was kind of saying, okay, this is my new front porch. But this is, almost a self-experimental type of situation he's put himself into. But it's also been from an educational standpoint. So the key thing with the dumpster is that it is on Houston Tillotson's campus. So there's also issues of community building where, yes, he's made this individual value choice, but also it's been a demonstration for all of the students and faculty and staff on campus. So people can go and check it out. And he's been on social media, and he shows all these pictures of individual people trying to climb in and out of the dumpster, some with greater success than others. But it's been a teaching tool, not just for himself, but also for the university community as a whole. And it's spawned this dumpster project, which is basically an educational tool. So this is the inside of the dumpster when he was living in it. And from this kind of wide-angle perspective, it actually looks fairly large from the inside as opposed to from the outside. But it's talking about, what would we need for sustainable living practices? What do we consider to be healthy? What do we consider to be environmental with our living spaces? And, it's kind of a fun demonstration tool also, but also kind of rethinking what we think of being a house or what we think of as permanence. And so the dumpster project is kind of this teaching tool that they're using at the university, and he's using with a couple of other professors to teach students about sustainability and kind of continuing on that project. So, we can see that when we're talking about individual values, it can take on a lot of different meanings depending on what those individuals' choices are. Sometimes we look at it at face value and we think, oh, well, they must be doing this, this, and this. But as you kind of observe more and get feedback from that individual, you start to see, why they make those choices and potentially use them as a learning tool for others. Okay, so that's definitely an example of individual values or personal values. So let's look at some more collective or community or cultural values. And again, this is kind of a modern current example, but when we talk about cultural values, we can look at all different spans of time and find examples of these community or cultural values that are pervasive throughout history and certainly architectural history. So this is a photo of London, England in 1940. And in 1940 and 41, the German army in World War II began a bombing campaign of central London and some other key sites throughout the United Kingdom. And it was essentially intended to weaken the British war manufacturing effort and kind of weaken the British will to be in the war. And this campaign continued for several months. It was about 9 months. So if we look at this, the pictures of people just kind of strolling through the streets, but after part of central London had been recently bombed. So, some people often refer to this as the Blitz. It's short for the Blitzkrieg of London in World War II. And between September 1940 and May 1941, there were over 40,000 civilians killed in these air raids, and over 1 million homes in London were either completely destroyed or damaged. And so you see people sleeping in the tube station or the underground station here in this photo. And eventually the German army was defeated later on, but the British manufacturing of like war goods and ammunition and tanks was not weakened by these raids like the Germans thought they would be. But one of the things that happens when we talk about our cultural or collective values as it pertains to architecture is if we define architecture as being an expression of who we are, and part of that becomes destroyed, something happens to us culturally and psychologically. And we see this again and again with natural disasters, man-made disasters, war-torn areas of the world, where that disintegration or that damage of our architectural structure and kind of the collective infrastructure has an effect on who we are as people. And sometimes that's inflicted on us by others. Almost always it is. Sometimes it's a natural infliction, but we have different reactions to that. And so London's reaction and the whole of England was quite galvanized in their effort to defeat the German army, but also to not be kind of psychologically broken. But this went on for 9 months, but the damage lasted for several years. So in 1944, Winston Churchill was appealing to British Parliament to rebuild London and the rest of the sites that were bombed in England. And you can imagine that after going through this war, and the war is not completely over in 1944, but they were trying to make an effort to rebuild just for the kind of collective psyche of the country, and also just physically so many sites had been destroyed. And so many people thought that they could not afford financially to rebuild at that time because they already had very little money and so much of their country had been destroyed. And so there's kind of this famous architectural quote that Winston Churchill had said in his appeal to Parliament. He said, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." And part of that is talking about, psychologically rebuilding so that they can kind of get back on track as a culture. And then part of that, there's a truism in that talks about, after a time, our environment does start to shape us and does start to kind of dictate or control our behavior, whether we are aware of that or not. And in the next unit, we'll talk more about architecture and behavior and how that does start to affect us. And you'll start to see, hopefully, that even if you are the same person, if you live in a certain environment, whether it's having a positive or a negative effect on you, that environment is going to have some kind of effect on you. Over time, it will change you. It could change you both physically, psychologically, mentally, but that environment is very critical. And so sometimes the rebuilding effort is as much mental and psychological as it is physical and part of the community. So we'll talk about that a bit in the next unit. And then think about how your environment has shaped you up to this point. The quiz for today is going to ask you, just write a couple of paragraphs about what you think architecture is, or maybe your personal experience with architecture. And if you haven't really, considered it up to that point, just take a few minutes and then write, 2 to 3 paragraphs about what you think architecture is, or kind of how it's affected you up to this point.